Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring something we're all familiar with: bad customer experiences. My guest, Michael Bartlett, has just written a book on the dark side of customer experience. In other words, the processes that companies engage in that irritate the hell out of us. The purpose of the book isn't, you'll be pleased to hear, to help companies make their processes even more irritating. Rather, it's to help them to identify when they might inadvertently do things that will turn otherwise loyal fans into enemies. Not only does he shine a light on practices that make this happen, but he also proposes some solutions for how to avoid them happening in the first place. Even if you're not in the business of managing frontline customer services, what Michael highlights is of interest because it can help you to understand why certain things are really irritating. And if you work in a function like compliance, ethics, InfoSec, or HR that designs processes for employees, then what applies in a customer service context also applies in your world. And if you think that's a poor comparison because employees aren't customers, then think about this. Of course, companies can legally tell employees what to do. And if you can see what they're up to, they'll probably do what you want. But when you can't watch what they're doing, or the thing you need them to do has a qualitative element, then you're going to be relying on their goodwill, which means you want to treat them a little bit more like you treat your customers. There's another human risk angle here. All the processes that cause irritation are designed by humans and will have human elements in them. Customer non-service is a perfect illustration of human risk in action. Before we begin, one word of warning. What you're about to hear will almost certainly bring back unpleasant memories of customer experiences you utterly detested. At least it did for me. But it's in a good cause. If you're having flashbacks to experiences you hated but did nothing about, then maybe it's time to change your bank, mobile phone provider, or whisper it, even your employer. With that said, please enjoy my discussion with Michael Bartlett on dark patterns. Michael, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hey, thank you, Christian. Lovely to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here. And before we get into the subject that we're going to talk about, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
I am a generalist. I guess that's probably the best and most succinct way to describe what I do. I've done lots of different things in my life. So I've started as a programmer, worked as a consultant for Accenture, worked in the film business for a little while as a film director and a film producer. Then immigrated to the USA from the UK. I'm originally from Kent in the UK, so I'm now living in Missouri with my wife and dogs, and kind of just gradually transitioned into working in CX and also incubating startups as one of my big believer in entrepreneurship. So that's kind of like what I do in a nutshell.
Wow, and you've just written a fabulous book on CX and a particular thing that really intrigues me, which I'll loosely define as dark patterns. Can you explain to people what that is, and then we'll come on and talk about what the book is trying to achieve?
Yeah, so dark patterns originate in the user experience world, kind of different designs that are made to deliberately mislead or trick people. In the customer experience world, and again, maybe I'm just being an optimist here, but I feel that in the customer experience world, it's not so much of deliberate manipulation and trickery. It's just people just haven't paid enough attention when they've designed things. Maybe they've not designed the experience at all. Or in some cases, maybe it's that it was a good experience, but as a business over time grows and becomes more complex, the customer experience begins to erode, and they're not really doing any sort of proactive, maintenance on the experience, that kind of thing.
And so you've taken this topic, and it's funny because I always think of it maliciously, but you're absolutely right. It's perfectly possible for stuff just to be crap, or companies to not, nobody's thought about it as opposed to maliciously getting it. So I always start, whenever I encounter one of these, I'm always like, oh my God, this is they're deliberately trying to do this. But you're quite right. There's just tons of practices out there that perhaps no one's thought of, or they haven't had time to think about, or an IT system's been designed. And so you've written a book that takes people through some of these dark patterns and says, look, here's an example of what a dark pattern is, and here's what we can do about it.
Yeah, so I wrote the book because I have a background in chess. I really like the game of chess. I don't play it so much anymore, but it's just something that I find fascinating. Chess is almost, it's such a large body of information that there's still new things being discovered about the game all the time. Even Kasparov said recently when he was interviewed that what Magnus Carlsen knows now are things that he didn't know when he was playing chess. So it's constantly evolving. And I like the idea that you can mine it and find new ideas and new patterns in there. And the great thing about chess is to get really good at chess, you need to be very good at understanding the patterns, not just seeing the patterns, but then knowing what to do. And it was that idea. It's called a priom. It's a Russian word. And that's what gave me the idea for the book. I thought, well, hang on a minute. There are definitely repeatable patterns that we see in the customer experience where things go wrong. We see them all the time, really common ones, like, for example, waiting too long in a line, or business just says no when when you're trying to get something done. And there's got to be a limited number of these. And if I can identify them, maybe I can identify what the correct maneuvers are to get out of those situations and improve the customer experience. So if I could find something like that, if it existed, that could be a worthwhile addition to the CX literature. So I just started doing some research and was lucky enough that I think I found the most common ones. I'm sure there's a limitless number out there, but I think I found the most common ones that apply. And so that's what the book does, is it talks you through them, talks through the common root causes, and then the best ways to go about fixing them.
And I loved it because as I was reading it, and I mentioned this to you before we started recording, I literally just started going, I remember that. And the bit that I thought was amazing was I can probably name the companies where these experiences happen because they stick with you. So to start us off, Mike, why don't let's pick a couple of your favorites. Can you give us a couple of examples of the sorts of things that you cover so people can get an idea? But this is really visceral stuff that when it strikes, it really gets to you.
Yeah. So the overly long wait is one of my favorite ones. So that is where you get in line for, it could be virtually in line. It could be you're in line physically. It could be that you've just gone into a restaurant, sit down and you've ordered, and then the wait begins. And it's the point where, and there's not an exact time and it's different for everybody, but you know when it happens because you feel it. You feel this nagging irritation, and then it starts to become more annoying and more annoying. And that's when you know you finally entered the overly long wait. And it's because obviously all of your previous experiences that you've ever had in that particular context, so waiting in a restaurant, ordering, that kind of thing, have given you an idea of what it should take. And as soon as your prediction of that becomes incorrect, it upsets you, because as social animals we get very upset when we fail to predict a situation, because in the past that's meant sometimes the difference between life or death. So then what happens is, let's say the amount of time that you wait is exactly the right amount of time and you never become fidgety or anxious or annoyed. You probably won't remember that experience. But if it's much quicker or it's much longer, i.e. it's different, you get a prediction error. That means you get a hit of dopamine. That means you're more likely to remember what happened. So that's one of the classic ones. Another one that's pretty interesting is the deadlock. And I use a very specific incident in my book of that poor Japanese doctor that got dragged off of the plane. But that's where you put your customers in an impossible position, and they just can't back down, and you're not backing down. And so there's some kind of a conflict occurs and normally results in a lawsuit.
This was the one, just for people that aren't aware, this is the one where the airline had overbooked, as is a common practice. And so people were told that somebody had to leave the plane, and ultimately this guy ends up literally getting dragged off the plane, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. And it went viral, and the CEO still tried to defend it after it happened. It was only after the clearly public opinion was against them that they then pivoted, which was very sad. And
so you go through and you've given these, I love the fact you've given these all names, which is in keeping with that whole sort of chess move mentality. And so you outline them. And as I was reading them through, I was kind of, as I said to you, I was nodding and just kind of going, yeah, I remember that one. It's almost like I was like ticking them off, like some sort of children's book where I was like, yeah, I've done that one, done that. And I read it and I thought, you explain them very simply. In many cases, it's either stories that involve you, or you've picked famous incidents where people will be aware of these things. And so these are, I mean, clearly you wouldn't be writing the book if they were uncommon, but they're incredibly prevalent in all of our experience. And I don't think one would, you probably wouldn't go a week without encountering at least one of these in some way, shape or form. And I wonder, on the one hand, the reason you can write the book is that they're common. On the other hand, why the hell does this happen? Because it's kind of like we know this, we recognize this. And the fact that I can smile and nod and sort of tick them off as I go through says that this is a big problem.
And I think maybe what it is because customer experience has traditionally focused on all the positive things. So customer experience is always about, here are all the things that you should do to make the experience better. Let's define the wow moments, all that kind of stuff. And the research that's coming out now, and I've actually known this for a long time anyway, I thought it was clear even up until now, but more recently a paper came out and it just basically said, negative emotions are much more powerful than positive emotions. Negative feedback gets processed quicker than positive feedback. All the things that are negative seem to have more of a bigger impact. And the person that brought my attention to this study said, so what are the implications for customer experience then? It seems like we need to turn everything on its head, and we should probably try and start fixing the bad experiences before we even worry about putting wow moments in. And I think that's the mind shift that might need to start occurring in CX, because you've got to follow the science. And at the end of the day, if you can have the best customer experience, best wonderful moments, and you could even have those over and over again. Let's say like a marriage that starts off really well, but then the bad experience happens, one or two that are really bad. Suddenly you've got divorce. And so, if marriages can fall apart, no one loves a business as much as they love another person that they propose to. So if it can happen in a marriage, it can happen in a business as well. So you've really got to watch out for those negative experiences, because the good experiences don't really help that much. The people just keep coming back. They don't make much of a difference in the long run, but the bad experience can destroy everything at that point. Then the customer's gone, and they're gone forever. It's really hard to win them back.
You made a really interesting point in the book around, if something really gets to us, we'll remember that it's almost like we hold a grudge for a heck of a long time. So I think you made the point that even when we've stopped being a customer, i.e. we've walked away from our mobile contract, or I'm never going back to that place again. So holding those long-term grudges, that's visceral and sticks with us. And that seems to be incredibly powerful and outweighs any sort of positive sense of emotion.
Yeah, and so that comes from, this is a new theory that I found recently. There's a really interesting book called The Tangled Mind. And the author has written all about how we build concepts in our brains and they associate with one another. So like a really good book for people that are interested in branding, I think. But in his most recent book, he talks about a researcher that he knows who came up with a theory. Because obviously when you know anything, like, the concept of a dog, when you first learned what a dog was, you had to attach that to some prior concept in your mind. And everything, you can trace them all the way back to a set of primitive concepts that comes from when you're a baby. You kind of get given a head start with certain things, like there's parts of your brain that can recognize faces, so the concept of a face is almost inevitable. But you'll build up a set of primary concepts, and then everything you learn from that moment onwards for the rest of your life, you just you stack them. You attach them one to the other. And so he said the theory that had come about was that fairness was attached to our concept of sensory balance. And he said it's very revealing, especially in language as well. When people use language and they use metaphors, it's a clue to the way that things are organized in our mind. And you hear people say, like, it was a very unbalanced relationship, or, the jury was very weighted in favor of the defense, that kind of thing. And so I realized that there's this balance exists in the customer experience with every relationship you have. And people kind of like keep score. They don't obviously do it rationally. It's all happening under the surface. But when you're in a relationship where you feel a little bit of imbalance. Now, the thing with sensory balance is you have a natural urge to restore balance. So my wife has a knee injury, and the knee injury caused her to naturally lean over a little bit. But our brain doesn't like that. Our brain has to make sure our eyes are always even. So it then adjusted another part of our body subconsciously without her realizing she was doing that. And that caused her to have some sciatic pain. So it's very interesting how the body always strives for balance. It has to have balance. So in the idea of the concept, the concept applied to customer experience is that if you've had a super bad experience with somebody, totally imbalanced, and then you get rid of the phone contract or whatever it is that's upset you, you still want to restore the balance, but there's no way to do it. Or is there? Maybe, and actually a friend of mine, he bought a game console from this company and he took it home. This was years ago, so he was a teenager when this happened, and it didn't work. So he took it back and they wouldn't refund him. So he stood outside their business for a week, and every single person that came to go in the shop, he told them what happened. And he did it for a week. And then I asked him, like, what made you decide to stop doing it? Did they ever give you a refund? He's like, no, they didn't care. He's like, I just got bored. But I think in my mind, what really happened is he felt, okay, I've done enough now to restore the balance, so I'm done.
But I think that is absolutely fascinating, because it's sort of like, and I love this idea of balance, and I've got this image of scales in my mind about we sort of just wanted to, it's gone too far one way, so we need to tip it back. So how can How can I kind of get them back? And I mean, what's interesting, that example, okay, that sounds a little bit silly, but I mean, it presumably could have had a financial impact on the business, but that's less important. What matters is how he feels about
That's
it.
right.
So this is an emotional response to these things. But of course, there will be people that take it to a logical extremity, which is I am going to exact revenge, and they will literally do crazy things. And so what I think is fascinating here is we tend to think of customers as assets of business. You look at customer base and average revenue per user, all those sorts of things. But of course, they can become, for the sort of human risk angle, they can become an absolute negative. They can be a drag on your business on social media, just in the way they react to it, the time that they will waste. And so I think this is a really, what you've basically pointed out here is to sort of say, don't just look at the positive side of it and customers as an asset. They can become a liability. So let's do what we do in relation to other liabilities and try and mitigate that. Let's stop somebody who is, clearly if they're your customer, that's a positive, but they are like, I guess in simple terms, right? It's possible any customer push them too far and you could send them in that opposite direction. And what we're trying to do here is a little bit of risk management and saying, what are these negative experiences? What are the root causes of things that can go wrong that can tip us into that situation where an asset starts to become a liability?
Yeah, and that's why the voice of customer is so important, because if you're not actively listening to your customers, you may not even know some of this stuff is going on. You may not even know they're unhappy. There are some customers who've had a few bad experiences and they thought, you know what, I didn't get any help the first few times, so I'm not even going to bother complaining anymore. And then they refer to those customers, especially if they can't go anywhere else, as hostages. And then those hostage customers can get really bad. And then at one point they become, no one uses this term anymore because it apparently has become a non-PC term, but we used to call them back in the day brand terrorists, which basically they would just go out of their way to destroy your company. They'd do whatever they could, tell everybody what they could, and even make sock puppet accounts up and write fake reviews because they were just all in on the destruction.
And what's really interesting is, so you go through all these different scenarios, and as I say, I kept recognizing and having flashbacks. And then what you do is you say, well, okay, here's a scenario, I'll explain it to you. And then you do the helpful thing, which is, well, how can we stop this from happening? Can you give us an example of one of those? How does that work?
So actually, I'll go back to the overly long wait because I really like the solution to that problem. So when somebody is waiting in line, there's really only, in theory, two ways that you can solve the problem. I've listed three in the book. I'll explain why. But you either solve the actual problem in the real world, so you look at the data, you see when the large number of people are coming in and when it's the lower frequency, and you make sure you've got the right number of staff on hand, the right processes in case one person takes too long. So you fix it operationally, or you do the Rory Sutherland route and you fix it psychologically. So you do whatever you can. And he made a joke about what was it? A train.
Supermodels on the train.
Yeah, and it's basically saying you want to put like pole dancers on there because then the goal was they wanted to shorten a 3-hour journey to be 2.5 hours, and they could spend billions of dollars doing it, or they could just make the journey so enjoyable that people it doesn't feel like 3 hours. And the cost of the psychological intervention typically is a lot cheaper than the operational one. I list three in my book because I also say the other thing you can do, which technically it falls into the psychological side, is you can just distract. If you can just distract them from the fact they're waiting, so they don't even know that they're waiting, that's another little technique that you can do. But very high level, and then people can obviously choose the tactics that they want. Another really good example is where I call it pass the buck. So pass the buck happens in two ways. So the first way is when a business refuses to take ownership of an experience. So I'm a shoe company. I mail some trainers out, some sneakers out to a client. The client gets them and they're like destroyed. And I blame the packaging company and the packaging company blames me. And then the poor customer gets stuck in the middle because they're passing the buck between them. And so I say, the way to solve that problem is whoever took the payment owns the experience. And you just got to do the right thing because that's the person that the customer's ultimately going to blame. But it can also happen at the employee level. So sometimes you'll have an employee and a piece of work comes to them, or maybe someone comes to them with a problem and they don't want to deal with it. They're like, well, you need to go talk to that person over there. And I basically say the fundamental reason why that happens, and it's very, very simple. It uses the framework that Matt Wallart produced. He's the guy that wrote Start at the End, which is the thing that you're supposed to do, which is help the customer. That behavior pressures that promote it are higher than the pressures that inhibit it, or vice versa. And whichever one wins means you either do the behavior or you don't do the behavior. And then I use a model called the ADKAR change management model, which looks at the awareness of the person. Are they aware what they're supposed to be doing? It looks at the desire. Do they actually want to do it? Do they have the right motivation? Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the right level of training to do the job? ADKAR, what was the other one? Do they have the ability? That's the second A. So that is, do they have enough time? Do they have the right systems? Do they have the right tools? And then the R in ADKAR stands for reinforcement. So you just got to make sure that you're reinforcing the right behaviors. So what you can do is, if somebody is passing the buck and not wanting to deal with a customer, you can just look at their behavior through the lens of the ADKAR model and look at the look at the inhibiting and the promoting pressures for each of those 5 letters and say, okay, it's going to be going wrong on one of those 5, maybe more than one of those 5, but you just have honest conversation with the employee to understand where that is, and then you can immediately address that and get the correct behavior. So nice and simple, and that's the way that I like to do these things, not trying to get too complicated, use nice, clean, high-level frameworks, and then the book almost becomes like a field guide. You encounter the issue, you run back through the book and say, oh, that's right, I remember the ADKAR model now, and then talk to the employee and try and fix the behavior that way.
And I think it's really interesting because you read them and you can, as I said, you recognize these. And that example you've just given, it's a classic thing where we all kind of know, 5-star hotel, you phone it doesn't matter who you call, right? Top hotels, it doesn't matter whether you phone the front desk or the concierge, right? They'll sort it out for you. And so everything is all around the customer, and you don't see the inner workings of the company, right? So if you happen to phone the wrong number, they'll fix it for you. And yet you've got the opposite, as you were saying. And I loved your example, the trainers or the sneakers ordering, because you could also add in the credit card company, right? You need to speak to them to process so let's bring more and more parties into this. And I think this is so, in the 21st century, it's so obvious that we ought to have mastered this stuff now. And there's less excuse with technology, with the sort of training that we can give people, the ability to track things. It should be really easy for companies to eliminate this stuff. And yet the fact that you're able to highlight them shows just how prevalent they are. And I think what's fascinating about the way you just talked about it is it becomes an organizational issue. And of course, I'm looking at the company that I'm dealing with as the cause of it. But ultimately, it's a human issue, right? It's an individual that is causing that particular problem. And each of the instances that you talk about, ultimately, it's, yes, I blame the organization, but I'm interfacing with a human being. And so this is, from a sort of human risk perspective, is ultimately saying this is a really good example of where nowadays, as we have humans in customer-facing roles, their potential to cause damage is even greater than it ever has been before.
That's right, yeah. Each of your individual employees within your business has that potential to completely destroy a relationship. I give an example in my book where I dealt with Lloyds Bank. Now, this was years ago, so we're going back over 2 decades now. 1997, I think internet banking had just been rolled out. And when it comes to technology, I am not an early adopter because I know technology, I know hackers. So I'm always late to the game on every technology. I think I had a flip phone for many, many years when everyone else had iPhones. It took me a long time. And so I stayed with paper statements. And my paper statements just stopped. They just stopped out, and I was like, okay, so I now have no idea what's going on with my bank, but I don't want to sign up for internet banking. So I called Lloyds Bank, and what happened was Lloyds Bank had changed their security process, and they didn't tell anybody. So rather than being greeted by the friendly person I normally get, I get this really sort of aggressive person saying, sorry, what was your name again? Okay, can you tell me on this date, how much did you spend? And I remember the first question he asked me because it had been that day. So he said, just out of the blue, not like, oh, we've got a new security protocol. It's just out of the blue, he said, earlier today you took a train ride. How much was the ticket for? And of course, I didn't know about this new process. So I said to the guy, I don't know, it's about $19, something like that, or £19, I would have said. And he said, sorry, I need the exact number, like very aggressively. And I was like, oh, okay. I remember thinking, what's wrong with this guy? Like, what a jerk. So I went and I got another thing. I was like, okay. And then I read out to him really sarcastically, it was £19.42. And I thought that was the end of it. And then he goes, well, on the 20th of October, you bought. And I said, look, how am I supposed to know that? And he goes, so are you telling me that you cannot answer the question? And I'm like, well, I don't have my paper statements. How am I supposed to answer the question? And he goes, sir, I'm going to have to terminate this call. And I mean, that guy, I wanted to punch his lights out. It really irritated the hell out of me. And so I complained to the bank, because what I did is I played phone roulette. So I phoned back, and I got a young girl on the phone, and she just sorted the problem out immediately. So she basically, I told her the problem. She said, yeah, we switched them back on. So I wrote a complaint letter in, and Lloyds Bank write back to me, and they say, he was doing everything that he was supposed to do, and he was following the process. She didn't, so we're going to follow up with her to make sure that she doesn't make this mistake in the future. And I couldn't believe it. And obviously, this is back before the internet really got going, so nowadays I don't think anyone would pull anything like that, because they'd be humiliated virally, and people might even record the conversations. But yeah, that one guy upset me so much that had I been in a position where I could have left them, I would, but I was a student at the time with a big overdraft, so I was stuck with them. But I absolutely would have left the way that guy spoke to me.
It's interesting because they sort of, the conclusion that's drawn from that is, oh, she's done something wrong. From a customer's perspective, right? That's good customer service, right? It's exactly what you want. And as you say, that's probably something of the time, and you would think that wouldn't happen. But it was interesting as I was reading the examples you've got, is that there are lots of companies, there will always be exceptions and things will go wrong, and there'll be non-standard procedures, and people will have requests that aren't necessarily standard, and that you can get sort of glitches. But I think we all recognize that. But when we're talking about something like what you've just talked about, that's fairly obvious that you sort of look at it and say, well, I get the anti-fraud piece, but ultimately there's a likelihood that, it's potential that a genuine customer. So we have to cater for the fact, yes, you might be a fraudster, but you might also be a genuine customer, and we need to manage those things intelligently. Now, we've learned over time about these things, and as you say, pressure like social media and TripAdvisor and all these sorts of things, very helpful for that particular consumer programs, all those kinds of things. But there are still companies nowadays doing these things. So even in an era where there is hyper transparency, and that airline example is a good one, where we're all more attuned to it, where companies are being held to account, this stuff still happens. So this is seriously ingrained in the way that, I guess, organizations incentivize their individuals to behave, right? Because you generally speaking, an employee will, as you rightly point out, right, employee responds to the incentives they've got in front of them. So there is something ingrained in many organizations, the way they do business, that even in this modern era of transparency, this is still an issue.
Yeah, that's where the culture side comes in, because if you really genuinely have empowered your employees to do the right thing by customers, then they'll try and do it. Now, they may actually go completely in the other direction. Like a CEO gave me an example recently where someone came into his store. It's a store that's a little bit like the equivalent of Lowe's, I guess, but in a different country. And they said, do you sell X item? And the employee said, no, but let me see if I can find someone that does. And then spent like 20 minutes on the phone using all that time up to help them. And actually, the company has now got a process in place where they have a special number where if they don't stock it, you can actually just have them call the number, and then they'll sort it out for you. It kind of is passing the buck a little bit, but at least it's like a warm transfer from the employee to take them over to the service desk and get that done. So, but the fact is, I'd much rather have that and then have to say to the employee, let's scale it back a little bit, let's put some process in place because we can use your time better, than the opposite, where they're just like, no, we don't sell that. Because there's always that opportunity to build that relationship, or if the relationship already exists, to continue to strengthen it. I always say every interaction that you have with a customer, you have to consider whether it's in person, written, is this interaction strengthening the relationship? Is it keeping it the same, or is it weakening it? So let's use the case of a business that fires an employee. So they send a communication out to the entire company. And those communications can be scary. They feel like some sort of authoritarian regime, like the person was marched out the back and shot in the middle of the night, and that doesn't strengthen, that actually weakens the relationship that all the other employees have, and it makes them nervous. So I went to my current employer, who's JMark, and I told him, I want you to change that message, because yes, I understand we're going to have to get rid of some people, some don't work out, but the way we communicate that to the rest of the employees, we need to show a bit more humanity in the way we do it. And it was just taking that very simple rule about, does it strengthen, keep it the same, or weaken it? Well, anytime you say that it weakens it, you got to do something about it. What I love about JMark is they're like a hotbed of testing new innovative ideas. They're always open to my crazy ideas that I come up with. So they were like, yeah, we'll just do it. And so they had me write the draft, and they changed it around a little bit. And then they started sending out a different message. And it was much warmer, much more empathetic, more human. And I just think we can look at every interaction, every communication that our businesses have with other human beings, i.e. customers and employees, and take that raw. And I think it will really help a lot.
And I think that's a really interesting example because clearly, and particularly processes that are driven by lawyers, or even, to a certain extent, risk and compliance as well, where you should look at and go, we need to protect the organization, right? So what we're going to do is let's send out a crystal clear letter that preserves our legal position with all the employees. And that'll protect us if we ever have to go to court. And what that ignores is the fact that actually, yes, it might achieve an objective with a certain individual, but it's going to irritate. And we're kind of look at it and go, what have they done that for? And so even if I'm not directly impacted by it, if I see somebody else having a crappy experience, I kind of go, well, that could happen to me. And I think this is a fascinating thing. So if I see somebody else being reprimanded in a store, or I hear of somebody else having a terrible customer service experience, what's stopping that from happening to me? And I find it astonishing that organizations they might get it, they may occasionally get it right for that one individual, but actually we riff off each other and we pay attention to what's going on. And that social aspect, I think, is really, really important. The antennae that we all have.
Yeah, well, we have to. That's how we evolved, to basically warn each other, signal to each other. So I think it was Simon Sinek that did a TED talk on this. And he said, as soon as something bad happens in a company, someone's back will get up and they're like, hang on a minute, did you hear about what happened? And everybody, it starts to go like a wave, like a pathogen. And suddenly everybody's freaking out, everybody's worried. And the stuff that you just talked about a minute ago on the legal side, like getting all the terms and conditions, we ran into this at JMark where we had a lot of clients that would be very interested. They'd get in the sales process. And then as soon as they got to the contract part, everything slowed down. And it's because it's almost like when you see a contract, you're like, okay, so this is the part where they try and trick me. So I've got to be really focused. It takes a lot of energy. And I suggested to them, I don't think it's ever been done. I think they just simplified the existing verbiage. But I told them, you should create a second version of the contract with cartoons and simple graphics, infographics. And it basically says, this is our pledge using normal language that any human being can understand of what our contract represents. But you have to understand that for legal reasons, to protect ourselves and to protect you, we do have to have that version of the contract. But we're giving you this version so that you can assess everything and just gauge whether it's right or not for you at this stage. The idea came to me from Roger Dooley's persuasion slide. And actually, when the JMark sales team heard about it, they all loved the idea. And they all use the analogy now, which is client starts off on the top of the slide and they start sliding down towards the closing the deal, if you will. And the slide needs to be nice and slippery so they can slide down nice and easy. And any point where they hit friction on that slide and slow down, it makes them less likely they're going to get there. And that's what the contract was doing. So I said, let's put this new version of the contract in and slide them a bit faster so it puts all their fears at ease about, what might be in the contract.
So I am now smiling because you've beautifully linked with two other episodes of the show. Links to that will be in the show notes. One is Roger Dooley has been on the show before. The second is I very recently spoke to a professor in Australia who is a lawyer who deals in what they call comic book contracts. And so there's an episode of that podcast out there. And so they've taken what you've just suggested to a even further, right? Which is to say that bit of logic that you had as we still need the legal contract. Actually, you don't necessarily. And what's fascinating is that if you start to look at these things, and again, I'll put a link to this episode in the show notes, and I'll send it to you as well, is you start to look at it and say, a lot of what we do there is entirely unnecessary, right? Which is we put things in there that we would, so she gave an example of an employment contract where you put a load of things in there that actually you would never, ever, ever pursue somebody for. For example, if they left and they took a couple of clients with them, I'm not talking, but you're not going to pursue them unless it's a major issue. So do we have to go into the infinitesimal detail on things that we would never pursue? And the act of making it visual, turning it into a cartoon, actually turns into something quite visceral, because then you're having to explain, what does this look like?
Yes.
How can we draw that? And what would that make us look like? And so there's a lot of work. So I think you're bang on the money here. And I think this is really interesting, because I think a lot of the reason that we have customer and let's go even broader than that, stakeholder unfriendly stuff, right? Supplier contract is to protect ourselves for logic. It's very logical reasons created by logical people in the organization. But what's fascinating is when that then hits a human relationship, which ultimately an act of employing someone or customer service that's a human interaction. And so these things that feel very logical, that cater for these theoretical situations, many of whom would never, to sort of 0.01% of times, they ruin that relationship because suddenly you've taken something that's very personal and put it into an entirely theoretical, inhumane context.
Yeah, it's like asking the person that you're in love with to sign a big, long 8-page contract when you get married.
Prenups is a really interesting example, right?
Yeah.
Because that basically goes against the spirit of what you're about to do.
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, I think that, I'll tell you though, maybe it's a little different in America because we're so litigious out here. I actually had a company threaten me because I worked for them and then I'd left them. And then the new company that I was in had hired me because someone else had also left them and I ended up becoming that guy's manager. Well, that guy was contacting people at the old company saying, you should come work for us, we're way better. And somehow they decided that it must be me that was doing it. So I actually got a letter from their lawyer saying that if we find out you're doing this, we're going to sue you. And I couldn't believe it. I was like being threatened for something I hadn't even done. So they get a bit funny out here, unfortunately, the Americans with their litigious nature.
But it's interesting, and it plays into. I mean, there's one of the things you talk about in the book is what, and this will make a lot of sense to UK listeners, less sense to other people. Is the sort of computer says no.
Yeah,
right? And that comes from a comedy show called Little Britain, where there's a basically very unhelpful lady who sits there, pretends to be helpful, taps into because it does nothing, and then says computer says no. And so you talk about that, and I think one of the other things, I mean, we talked about lawyers. One of the other things I think is interesting about these things is that actually systems and processes and bureaucracy is one of the other big enemies of this piece. And you'd think with tech, again, we'd be better at this stuff, but a lot of the examples that a lot of your examples in the book are sort of face to face, and you depict it as, I think about it as me having a physical experience, but the same thing applies online. I can be just as irritated. And that technology enables amazing customer experiences, but it also allows for the most appalling ones.
Yeah, well, it's because people, I think they see technology and they see the next shiny thing, and maybe they get caught up in some of the sales spills from some of these technology companies. I mean, there are so many of these technology companies involved in CX, and I say to myself, like, what exactly is it that they do? I'm still not 100% sure on it. I have a company locally here that just raised $3 million, and I still can't. I've looked at their website and I can't figure out what it is they actually do. And I think people get suckered into this and they buy the stuff, and then they don't know what to do with it. I was at the Medallia conference. They were kind enough to invite me to their conference in 2019. And there was sort of all the people there are mainly either existing clients or prospects. And I remember meeting somebody who said that she had, sorry for the noise, I've got my dogs with me here in the background. She said she installed it but hadn't done anything with it because it was so complicated. So she was actually waiting to speak to an expert that could show her how to use the software. And it may not even have been that it was complex. I've never used the software, so I don't know. But sometimes maybe just the thought of trying to be the person that administers a system like that might be too much. So I think, and I had an incident where I got a document management system, and we went through all the training and everything, and then the guys sort of onboarded us. They were gone, and then we didn't know what to do because you don't retain all that information. So sometimes you're left with all these pieces of we call it technology debt. And then you've got organizational debt, and suddenly all this stuff just starts adding up, and it ends up just making the customer experience worse.
Right. It's strange, isn't it? Because there are lots of dynamics that point towards customer experience getting worse. So if I look at, tech's one of the things you pointed out, but there's also things like, just-in-time supply chains, which make perfect sense from an economic perspective, as we've seen under COVID, start to sometimes make less sense when the scenarios change and things don't quite work out the way they should. But as we look at, customer service in many respects could from an economic perspective is a drag, right? Because it costs time and effort, and we have to do extra things, and it's sort of irritating because it stops the natural flow of things. And so in some cases, this drive towards efficiency, let's get rid of customer service operatives, right? Because what are they? We can do without them. People can self-serve. Starts to produce a much worse customer experience. And so many of the things that you talk about, I would argue, are not enhanced by a drive towards efficiency.
Well, it's like when you start doing that, you commoditize things. So let's just give a really quick example. Bit of a out of left field, but it's still very relevant. If you think about the school system, like that used to be something that parents did. They raised their kids, they taught their kids, and then we essentially commoditized it. So we outsourced it. And so I think it's this constant obsession with trying to commoditize things to make things repeatable, replicable. It takes the humanity out of it. And people want that. They still crave that. I did a presentation back in 2018 on AI because people were freaking out about, AI is going to take away all the jobs and all this kind of stuff. And actually, when you look at all of the other major revolutions we've had, they've actually created more jobs than they've eliminated. And so I was trying to reassure people that that's going to happen with AI. And the jobs that are looking the most promising are actually jobs that have the human element to them. So any job that requires that human touch is going to be more valuable in the future than it is now because everything else is being commoditized and, being turned into AI, basically.
I always looked at it and sort of say, look, if you can give it to a machine, right, i.e. it's predictable, codifiable, then of course you give it to a machine. So what does that leave people left to do? The answer is not nothing. The answer is the stuff the machines can't do, which is, as you point out, the things that require those higher cognitive skills. So that's nuance, emotional intelligence, judgment, creativity, the human touch. Plenty of things I can think of that we could theoretically give to machines, but that wouldn't be particularly good from a societal outcome. And, dentistry, I think, is a really interesting example, right? Do I want a human dentist or do I want a robot that's going to prod around my mouth? I'll probably go with a human for now because the downside of the robot going crazy feels very. But I think that, for me, is fascinating because that's exactly when, that is when we're going to be at our best. And so you're right. It's not going to be, we're just going to do different things. And therefore, I think a lot of the stuff that you're talking about there, thinking about the human interactions and the experience people have, starts to become much more important. And I love this idea that we sort of shift training for people from here's the list of things to do into your world where you're also saying, well, here's a ton of things I also don't, this is the other flip side, right? Do not do this because this produces a really bad outcome. And that feels like a little bit of a waste of time, back to the efficiency point. But actually in this world where we need people to be spending more time doing things that the machines can't, more customer service, more engagement, more that's precisely when this stuff starts to get really important. So the nature of what human labor is going to be doing is shifting. And therefore, to your point, we need to shift the skills that we give them to be able to do that.
Jean Bliss actually talked about this in her book, Chief Customer Officer 2.0. It's a really neat way of looking at things because the problem is you can have a training manual. They still do it even now where you have these policies and you read the policies and they're like 3 pages each. And then you say, I agree. So how much of that does the person actually remember? So Jean Bliss said it's very straightforward. You create a code of conduct and you basically say, these are all the behaviors that we will absolutely make sure that we do to honor our clients. And these are the behaviors that we will not do because they dishonor our clients. Simple set of behaviors. And then you can reinforce that culturally. And I talk about that in the book, the culture side, because one of the problems I've had with the CX world is every time you read a book on culture written by an expert, they normally have a nice framework that has a nice little acronym to it that's easy to remember. But the problem is each expert has a different framework. So something's not right. So because if there's a fundamental truth, they'd all have the same framework. So I thought to myself, well, am I just seeing survivorship bias here maybe? I want to know what the real truth is behind culture. So I did some research into this, and I got some really good insights from Brett Weinstein, who is an evolutionary biologist, and Luca Delano, who's very well known. He presented at Nudgestock. And what I found was that culture, essentially all culture really is it's repeatable behaviors that have stood the test of time. So normally used, for a whole species through, thousands of years, but definitely still applies to the business world, even though the timescales are much faster. Because basically in the animal world, if you're in a pack of animals and one of the animals does a behavior that's going to endanger the group, the animal gets kicked out of the group. So they reinforce their own culture in a different way, but it's the same sort of thing. It's the equivalent of someone getting fired from a company. And the problem is companies don't think about what are the behaviors that we should be doing and what are the behaviors that we shouldn't be doing that ultimately are going to make us successful. If they thought about that, then that would help them actually have a much stronger culture. But they have to reinforce that as well. I mean, not everybody's going to be a good fit. But using Gene Bliss's idea of a code of conduct, it can be represented in a very simple way. It just has to be lived by everybody. You can't have like some person at the top saying, here's the rules for everybody else, but I'm going to flout the rules, which we've seen recently with the whole COVID thing. Because as soon as that happens, people think, oh, well, they're not taking this thing seriously, so I'm just not going to do it now. And then all chaos breaks loose. So it's better to make sure that everybody's stepping in uniform, doing the same thing, and that those behaviors are they're made very, very explicit. And one of the ways you can do that, obviously, we've seen it a lot, is with corporate values, cultural values. Because as Lucas says in his book, all a value is it's a bucket that we categorize actions, that we categorize behaviors. So as long as we can make those explicit when we onboard our employees or even reboard them, that's a new concept I heard recently, then at least everybody's exhibiting the right behaviors. And then that makes sure that the company is successful in the long run and for the future as well.
This sort of internal versus external image, right? What we might, if it's a human being, sort of authenticity, I think is really interesting and plays into what we're talking about, right? Which is, if you have a culture that is bullying, shouting at people, aggressive internally, then it's going to be very difficult to layer on a nice, sweet customer service focus at the front of that. Mm-hmm. Always struck me when I watched sort of Gordon Ramsay, who, and I know it's done for TV, but this sort of shouty chef thing in the kitchen, and then you have the front of house where the food. If you shouted at the customers in the restaurant, they wouldn't come back.
That's right. Yeah.
And so you do have this interesting disconnect there, and I think they can kind of do that because they recognize that those two things are separate, but there is a certain amount of aggression and hostility that for the people. I guess for the very simple for the serving staff who are taking the food out of the aggressive, shouty kitchen into the I need to be nice and kind, that's quite a problem. And I think there are lots of, it sometimes amazes me that works seemingly as well as it does for many, many restaurants. But this idea about companies' external face and internal face, I think is interesting, because I think a lot of the dynamics you talk about are driven by the fact that on the one hand, we're trying to deliver something nice, quality service to customers, and yet internally we don't have that supported by, to your point, the values and systems that we'd need to do that.
And actually, the people that are delivering the experience, it's amazing how this stuff happens. So you have a really negative boss. I'll give you a great example, actually. So the startup I was at, they just fell apart because of the culture. I had a really negative boss who was constantly questioning everything. So on the side, because I used to be a film director, when the film business looked like it was going to collapse, I thought, well, I might try my hand at doing some wedding videos just to see if that's really something I'm interested in. Didn't really particularly enjoy it, but I did one just to see if it was worth trying out. And when I did this one video, I'd come home from work one day and I was just chatting to my wife about it. And I was in a pretty bad mood because I'd suffered a lot of abuse that day from my manager. And she said, well, Mike, did you even talk to the bride and groom about what they want? And I mean, it just set me off. And I brought the negativity home with me, and it colored my lens so that any time that anyone said anything to me, even if it was a well-meaning comment, it was taken as negative. So if you take somebody who's in the back office with the bad manager and then they're supposed to bring the food out, and maybe a customer says something because they're not happy, that employee has a higher chance of blowing up than if they didn't have all of that bad culture behind them. So it will bleed out into the customer experience one way or another. It just depends on the resilience of the employees. Ideally, you would make the two things match one another culturally and value speaking so that people don't have to be fake. They can just be themselves and they don't have to worry about not transmitting that negativity. It's also just really bad for health to hold on to that negativity. There's been many studies that have showed the relationship between your immune system and how you're feeling psychologically as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's always struck me that anybody who's having to fake anything is under tremendous amounts of stress, and that might be having to hide your sexuality. That might be, having a boss that shouts at you, and then you need to be nice to someone. Just not being able to be yourself. That takes a huge psychological weight. And I think it is interesting actually when we think about the kind of the top quality customer service. So the way that we compensate for stuff is going to go wrong, right? In a restaurant, deliveries are not going to appear, and so we're not going to have things. So we need to pacify customers. Planes are going to get delayed. Maybe they will get overbooked, not perhaps as aggressively as the airlines do it, but that's going to happen from time. Stuff's going to go wrong. And so at that point, we need people to kind of really be humane and sympathetic and empathetic. And so we need them to be the best version of themselves. And to your point, if there's any kind of baggage there that they're carrying, that starts to get really hard.
Yes, unfortunately, yeah. The rewards and recognition part plays some role in it, but I mean, really, if the key is to first of all, have the right culture, then hire people that reflect those cultural values. So you're bringing in the right kind of people to continue that. And then I spoke to a really interesting author recently. His name's Joe Wheeler, and he wrote my favorite ever customer experience book. It's called Managing the Customer Experience. He wrote it with Sean Smith. It was written years ago, like 2003 or something like that. And it's still head and shoulders the best book, even though it hadn't been written when social media was even around, because the principles are almost timeless. And he told me recently that he was referring to a book that he wrote called The Ownership Quotient. I think that was the name of the book. They looked at different companies and how they handled their employees, and he found that the reward side wasn't as impactful as the recognition side. Like the one thing that they all had in common, some did well with rewards and others did well without rewards, but the one thing that they all had in common was the recognition was there. People were recognized for doing a really good job, and they were recognized in many different ways. There's no real pattern that worked better than others, but that was the key concept. So making sure, recognizing people for doing the right thing. And I think that's going to be an important key factor in the next 10 years when you look at customer experiences. First of all, do the people even want to be in that job? Do they feel they're being compensated well enough? And then at that, once the basics are met, the hygiene factors, if you will, then is everything else on top? How's that looking? And that really comes down to, are they being recognized for the role that they're doing? Do they feel that they're making a difference? And I think that's very important to people now.
I think what's fascinating about all this is obviously your start point is what's the customer experience like? But we start to move into, and we were talking before we started recording about the employee experience, and a lot of these challenges and sort of things that are irritating to humans apply equally in those situations. So we've not just got employees as being the agents of sort of bringing joy or irritation to customers. They're also themselves experiencing that within the organization, and that might be sort of using organization function. It might be the way their boss is interacting with them, might be the HR function, whatever. So there is this fascinating piece that's all placed together about how do we get the best experience for how do we get the best out of people. And therefore, if we start tackling this, so in some respects, I viewed what you'd written as a sort of symptom of organizations that have problems. And it's probably not just the customer front end, as you point out. It's probably a whole host of other things that are leading to that. So if you've got IT people who don't particularly care, they've coded stuff up, they can code without thinking about the end user. Customer services operative, this is just a job, I can't wait to get off my shift. I'm just going to get this done as quickly as possible, get rid of this problem, fob that customer off. All of that stuff points to, so it's almost you've come at it from an angle that's sort of identified the symptom, if you like, as opposed to we need to think a little bit further than that and say, yeah, of course we need to solve those problems, but we need to go a whole lot further if we want to avoid, I guess, other manifestations. Because you could play whack-a-mole with some of your things and solve one problem, and then it'll transfer over to being a different kind.
That's kind of what, when they promote people to their level of incompetence, is doing. They're fixing a problem that doesn't really exist, and then they're creating a problem. But yeah, with the whole employee side of things as well, the biggest issue for me with the employee experience and the patterns is the patterns that will emerge that will let you know if something bad is going on should be behaviors that I think a lot of them are catalogued in my book. There are additional ones that exist for employees, but like here's a good example. Somebody takes the majority of their sick days in the first 6 months of the year. I know that, I don't have the evidence to back that up, but I know that I've been there myself.
It's possible that that's a genuine illness, but statistically,
and that's really what the patterns are saying as well. Yeah, I should probably stress that. I'm not saying this is definitively what is happening. What I'm saying is, if you see this pattern, this is likely what's happening, and these are the likely best solutions, but you need to employ the iceberg model. You need to go in and look at the root causes yourselves. But yeah, that would be one. Is like, I remember the first job I ever had when I moved over to the US, I don't think I maybe took 1 or 2 days sickness, if that. It was rare because I was sick all the time in England, and allergies are terrible out here in Missouri. But I would just love my job so much. I just always felt great. And then as soon as they changed the manager, I remember I'd used almost all my sick days up. in the first 6 months. And I would always wake up angry on a Monday. Well, actually, it didn't matter what day of the week it was. Every day I would wake up angry and I would go to sleep angry. And I would always get what they call the Sunday night blues, where you start to feel depressed because you know you've got to go into work the next day. But there's definitely a lot of those patterns that can be identified. But they shouldn't need me to write a book on it as well. I think good managers should be exploring this stuff, and employees should feel safe enough to be able to talk about this kind of stuff in the customer feedback. Cass Sunstein, he said that when it comes to employee feedback, the very minimum that you should have in your company is at least for people to be able to submit feedback anonymously, because not everybody's comfortable that their voice is going to be treated fairly if they speak up. But if you can say something anonymously, then at least the information gets out there. If they choose what to do with it, that's up to them. But so that's very important as well. But yeah, it's all, at the end of the day, if you boil it down, it's human experience really that underlies everything. And all of the drives that I mentioned in my book, all of the concepts that relate to good and bad experiences, so goal friction and social friction, it employs to all of these things as well. So employee experience too.
Fantastic. And I think it's been really interesting hearing you talk about it, because I think it's, on the one hand, I read the book and I was like, it felt, there are lots of examples in behavioral science where you've got sort of, here's a biases checklist and let's go through these things. And it's a useful gateway. But I think what's interesting about yours is I loved it because I kind of nodded and went, yeah, seen there. There's probably a few I still need to go and collect, by the way. So I'm going to go find experiences so to tick the full list off. But I love it because I think you're right. This points is a really interesting thing. And particularly as we have greater transparency, that ability to use these incidents not as here's a little bit of feedback from one irritating customer, but actually what's going on here? Is there more? And fine, if you've got one of these incidents and you get one complaint from a customer, it's a unique set of circumstances, that's fine. But if you're getting lots of customers telling you X or Y is happening, that's a really powerful piece of feedback. That isn't just we need to solve that particular process, but let's go a little bit deeper into second and third order and see what's driving.
That's right. It's a pattern. So it's happened more than once. So now we need to get underneath it and find out what are the structures that are causing it and what are the mindsets that are enabling those structures. Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous note on which to end then. So before we do, remind people what the book is called and where they can get hold of it.
So the book is being launched just February the 22nd. So 2/22/22. I didn't do that by design. It just happened, a happy accident. And it's going